Imagine this for a second. One of the world's two great superpowers, an empire that stretched across 11 time zones, just vanishes. Not because of a war, not from a foreign invasion, but it just imploded from the inside out. Well, that's exactly what happened to the Soviet Union. And in this explainer, we're going to unravel the incredible story of how this giant fell.
The beginning of the end really seemed to start here, November 9th, 1989. For almost 30 years, the Berlin Wall was this massive, concrete symbol of the division between East and West, communism and capitalism. And then, all of a sudden, in one single night, regular people armed with hammers and pickaxes did what everyone thought was impossible. They just started tearing it down. This was the first crack in a dam that was about to burst wide open.
So that brings us to the central question, right? This wasn't just some wall coming down. It was the start of a chain reaction that would make an entire empire disappear. How could the second most powerful country on Earth, a nation with thousands of nuclear weapons, just disintegrate? That is the puzzle we are going to piece together.
To really get why it collapsed, we have to understand what the Soviet Union was in the first place. On the surface, it looked like this mighty, invincible superpower. But underneath all that strength, there were these deep, fundamental cracks. It was like a giant, for sure, but a giant with feet of clay.
The whole Soviet system was born out of the fire and chaos of the 1917 Russian Revolution, and its goal was totally radical: to create a brand new kind of society built on the idea of equality. Private property was basically abolished, and a single party, the Communist Party, controlled everything. And I mean everything, from the biggest factories to the smallest farms. It was a massive, unprecedented social experiment.
The problem was, the gap between the Soviet promise and the day-to-day reality was just huge. The promise was this utopian dream, an equal society where the state took care of you from cradle to grave, all powered by an advanced economy that was supposedly second only to America. But for the average person, the reality was a rigid authoritarian state with no freedom of speech. And that mighty economy? It was stagnating, which meant endless lines and severe shortages for even the most basic things, like bread or shoes. Now, people weren't just silent about it, but they had to be really clever. They told jokes. There's this famous one from the time. A party official asks a farmer, "So, how was the potato harvest?" The farmer says, "By the grace of God, we have mountains of potatoes." The official gets angry and says, "But comrade, there is no God." And the farmer just replies, "And there are no mountains of potatoes either." Jokes like this were a kind of secret code, a way to laugh at the huge gap between the official government propaganda and what everyone knew was the harsh reality.
Okay, so by the 1980s, these cracks are really turning into fractures. The system is clearly failing. And right into the middle of this crisis steps one man with a bold plan to fix it all: Mikhail Gorbachev. But his plan would turn out to be a massive and ultimately fatal gamble.
When Gorbachev took power in 1985, he inherited a total mess. The Soviet Union was falling way behind the West technologically, and it just couldn't provide a decent life for its people. The economy was stuck in neutral, crippled by the insane cost of the arms race with the US and a bloody, draining war in Afghanistan. He knew deep down that major changes were needed just to keep the country afloat.
So he came up with two radical new policies. The first one was perestroika, which means restructuring. That was all about fixing the broken economy. The second one was glasnost, which means openness. And honestly, this was the truly revolutionary part. For the first time in generations, he allowed more freedom of speech and real political debate. Now, his goal was never to destroy the Soviet system. He was trying to save it. But here is the great irony of the whole story. The very medicine he prescribed to cure the system actually ended up accelerating its collapse. By loosening the state's iron grip, he unleashed all these forces that nobody, not even him, could predict or control. Some people felt the reforms were way too slow and they wanted more freedom faster. But others, especially the old guard Communist Party hardliners, felt their power slipping away and thought he was moving way too fast. Gorbachev got caught in this impossible tug-of-war, and he ended up losing support from pretty much everyone.
And with the central government weakened like that, things began to unravel with just incredible speed. The reforms had opened a Pandora's box, and the empire started to crumble, like one domino falling after another.
I mean, the speed of this collapse was just breathtaking. In 1988, Lithuania starts demanding independence. A year later, the Berlin Wall falls. By 1990, the Communist Party loses its 72-year monopoly on power. It's over. In August of '91, the hardliners stage a desperate coup to turn back the clock, but it fails. The people had tasted freedom and they refused to go back into the box. Just a few months later, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus get together and declare the Soviet Union is finished. And finally, on Christmas Day 1991, Gorbachev resigns. The Soviet Union officially ceases to exist.
So what was the final blow? The economy was weak, yeah. The politics were broken for sure. But the killer punch was nationalism. For decades, the passionate desire for independence in places like Ukraine, Lithuania, and Georgia had been brutally crushed. Glasnost, that policy of openness, just opened the floodgates. This passion for national identity and sovereignty became an unstoppable force that literally tore the Soviet Union apart from the inside.
So the Soviet Union was gone. But what came next was not the easy, prosperous future that so many people had hoped for. The transition from communism to capitalism was a chaotic and, for many, a very painful process known as shock therapy.
The idea, which was often pushed by Western economists from places like the World Bank, was called shock therapy for a reason. The plan was basically to rip out the entire old communist system as fast as possible and replace it with a capitalist one, almost overnight. This meant privatizing everything the state used to own and just throwing the doors wide open to the free market.
The results were, well, they were often catastrophic. Instead of a thriving new economy, you got a total collapse. Take a look at this building. This was the headquarters of Bank, which was Russia's second largest bank. It went bankrupt in 1998, and when it did, the life savings of thousands of ordinary families and businesses just vanished. It became a powerful symbol of the financial ruin that was sweeping across the country. The consequences were devastating. Something like 90% of Russia's industries were sold off, many for ridiculously low prices, in what one person called the largest garage sale in history. The Russian currency, the ruble, completely collapsed. Sky-high inflation wiped out people's life savings. The old social safety net was dismantled, which pushed millions of people into poverty. And into that chaos stepped a powerful mafia that took control of huge parts of the new economy.
But the collapse didn't just reshape the former Soviet Union, it fundamentally changed the entire world. So let's zoom out for a second and look at the massive legacy of this event.
The collapse caused three huge shifts in global politics. First, the Cold War was over. Just like that. The decades-long standoff between two nuclear superpowers was finished. Second, the world went from being bipolar, with two competing powers, to unipolar. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. And third, a whole wave of new countries emerged from the wreckage, each one trying to figure out its own path.
And you can really see the scale of that change right here on this map. A massive part of the world was completely redrawn. From the Baltic states like Estonia and Latvia in Europe, all the way to the new nations of Central Asia like Kazakhstan, the global stage was suddenly crowded with all these new players, each navigating this brand new world order.
And that brings us to our final thought. The collapse of the Soviet Union might seem like it's ancient history, but it is not. The world we are all living in today was forged in the fire of that disintegration. So the question I want to leave you with is this. The Soviet Union is gone, but how do its echoes, its legacy, and all the unresolved tensions from its collapse continue to shape the conflicts and the alliances of our own time?